Welcome to Biztech's Trade Conversation Show. I'm Brian Fernandez, and our guest today is Chris Humphrey, Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council. The EU-ASEAN Business Council is the primary voice for European business within the ASEAN region and is based in Singapore. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Now, Chris, before we start, can you give the audience a quick overview of the EU-ASEAN Business Council and what you do?
Yeah, certainly. We are a trade association. We represent the interests of European industry, both goods and services, across the ASEAN region. We were set up originally with a very clear mission, which is to improve the trade and investment climate within Southeast Asia for European businesses and also between Europe and Southeast Asia. So it's work on trade facilitation, it's market access, it's dealing with regulations. It's very advocacy focused.
Okay, and how are you structured? Could you please explain who your members are and who your key stakeholders are?
Yeah, well, the members are quite simple. It's large European MNCs across a number of different sectors, so pharmaceutical, automotive, financial services, digitech, travel, and plus on top of that, the 9 European chambers of commerce that exist in the region. So every country in ASEAN has a Eurocham apart from Brunei at the moment. So that means that we can put our hands in our heart and say we are representing all of European industry across the ASEAN region. The people that we deal with mainly are governments in Southeast Asia. It's ministers of finance, ministers of trade, agriculture, health, you name it, industry, and also then the European Commission and the European delegations.
And how do you engage? You know, Chris, ASEAN is a very diverse animal. Yes, it's 10 member countries, but you have the likes of Singapore and you also have the likes of Myanmar on the other end of the spectrum. How do you engage your various stakeholders in terms of these governments?
Well, a lot of the stuff we do is at the regional level. So it's involving ASEAN working groups and ASEAN ministerial groups. So working through the ASEAN Secretariat. That's at one level. But the beast that is ASEAN means you also have to play at the national level. So we do regular mission trips and engagement with national governments in the region. We'll take, in more normal times, we'd have been taking large delegations of European business leaders into countries, meeting a whole range of ministers over 3 or 4 days, having some good roundtable discussions with them. And then at the Secretariat level, so my level here, we do a lot of engagement. We do a lot of consultation work with governments. We answer to their requests for information from us. We take part in the development of regulations with them as well. So a lot of it is done at different tiered approaches. So one level, ASEAN finance ministers, trade ministers, big high level meetings. Other times, like this morning, for instance, I was in a long discussion about very technical customs issues at a much more working level.
Now, ASEAN has been hit really hard with this pandemic and COVID and so forth. What's the Council's view on the economic recovery story in ASEAN?
Yeah, well, last year the region took a big knock. Trade was down, FDI was through the floor, and that was true, of course, for much of the world. We entered this year hoping there'd be signs of recovery, and I think we were showing signs of recovery, but the recent spikes, the recent moving back to lockdowns or virtual lockdowns in much of the region, I think has taken the wind out of the sails of any recovery. And if we're lucky, we'll get to the end of this year and the losses from last year might be recovered back, but probably won't be. So I think now we're talking about recovery going into 2022, because we've got to get over the current situation, which means governments have to do a lot more in the region on rolling out vaccines. And I think at some point, they're gonna have to bite the bullet and say, we need to learn to live with this. So you'd have heard announcements from Singapore recently saying, let's treat COVID as endemic as soon as we can. And I think the rest of the region needs to start doing that, because at the moment, people are hurting. Every business is hurting. Every single business is hurting in some way or other. Some more than others, of course. Hospitality, tourism, which are bedrocks of much of the economies throughout much of the region, are really, really in dire straits.
Okay, so Chris, I'm going to come back to that, but I want to touch on something that you've put out this year, which is very related to the situation at hand, which is basically a study that's covering healthy aging and lifetime immunization in the region. Now, can you tell us about that, because it's so relevant today?
Absolutely. Well, I think most of us look at Southeast Asia, and I've been living here a very long time now, And we think this is a young, very vibrant, very dynamic region, which it is today for the main part. But it's a region which is aging rapidly. And at some point over the next 10 years, we're going to have more countries like Singapore, which will become age societies. Thailand, within 10 years, will have the same age profile that Japan has got today. And not many people realize that. You look at the Philippines and Vietnam, very young today, but that doesn't mean in 20 years' time, they're going to be very old. So we need to start thinking about how we can look after the seniors in the societies, or the future seniors, help them live longer, healthier, more productive lives, so they become less of a burden on healthcare systems, and less of a burden on those of us that will be still working and still paying taxes in the future. And so the whole idea behind this paper was, what can we do to help these people and ensure they have healthier lives? And part of that is, of course, bringing out more life course immunizations, the phrase that we use. So at the moment, we immunize our kids. We all naturally immunize our kids, and in most countries, the vaccinations for kids are mandated. You have to do it. But we tend to forget about, as we get older, we actually become a bit more vulnerable to some things like influenza, for instance.
Yes.
And there are immunization schemes out there that you can have. So it's all about, how do we get those? How do we make them affordable? How do we encourage people to take those immunizations so they don't get sick, so they can live longer and healthier lives going forward and have a happier retirement, perhaps?
Now, Chris, this is a broader issue of access to healthcare across the region, because you have different levels of healthcare investment of different countries. You've got Singapore on one hand, and then probably Laos at the other end of the spectrum in terms of healthcare investment and access to healthcare. What are some of the challenges that you think that could be overcome, or the barriers that could be overcome in order to then, as you said, ensure that the elderly have a better quality of life, for example, post-retirement?
Well, there's a series of things, Brian. At the council, actually, over the last 18 months, we're doing a series of different reports on healthcare-related issues. One of those was about sustainable healthcare financing, and every country in Southeast Asia is aiming for a thing called universal healthcare coverage. So we have great healthcare, and it's available to everybody in society that wants it, and we can provide their needs. That's unaffordable. It's absolutely unaffordable for every country in ASEAN, including Singapore.
Yeah.
So how do you afford it? Well, it's a mix of taxation, it's a mix of out-of-pocket expenditure, it's a mix of insurance, it's also governments doing better procurement, less wastage in their own systems. And we read a report on that last year that sets out all those steps, and that's necessary for all of us, not just the elders or the more senior people in our societies. It's from the day you're born until the day, unfortunately, you're no longer with us, and that is absolutely necessary for that. We've also done stuff on self-care, which is how we as individuals can take better care of ourselves. So better diet, more exercise are obvious ones, access more to over-the-counter medicines so that you can medicate yourself for very minor ailments as well. And the region needs to do a lot more in that approach. So in parts of the region, over-the-counter medicines are readily available. In other parts, they're very hard to come by. So you've got different regulations in different places, which means people can't look after themselves. And then on the immunization front, the report you're talking about, the healthy aging one, it's more about governments putting in place the programs, the education systems, encouraging doctors to tell people what's available for them. And then, of course, there is the cost aspect to it. One part is, let's have a look at the insurance schemes you have, see if you can't get insurers to, through your premiums, provide some money to help you get the immunizations that you need, as well as then governments making them more readily available and pushing out immunization programs.
Okay, Chris, all well and good, but the thing is, right now, what's facing governments in ASEAN is, how do we basically control the pandemic? We've got all these extra expenditure which is related to COVID-19. Some of our countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, classic example right now, the public system is overwhelmed.
Yep.
So how do we then, what are the measures that you have recommended in your policy paper in terms of execution to help governments move in the right direction?
Well, I think COVID-19 is providing some exceptional circumstances for all of us at the moment. And the answer on COVID-19 really is improve the vaccination rollouts right across the region. The countries that are doing it better need to help their near neighbours, because unless ASEAN moves collectively on things like vaccine rollouts for COVID-19 and then economic recovery from COVID-19, we're all going to continue suffering. The 10 need to be working in step with each other on this particular issue. In terms of the more general approach, we need to get to a position where people have access to healthcare who actually need the access to healthcare. So you actually would have seen yesterday, I think on the news for Japan, they were talking about, well, if you've got COVID, don't come to hospital unless you're really, really, really sick, because you're taking up bed space that we need for the really, really, really sick. And there has been a tendency, I think, for much of the region, indeed much of the world, when you have COVID, they're putting you in hospital or a community care facility. When actually you probably don't need to. You could isolate at home and you'll recover from it naturally as well. So we need perhaps a different approach when it comes to things like COVID. And we need to make sure that we have healthcare systems which are up to task, which they're not in much of the region. I mean, in Singapore they are, and Malaysia's not too bad in terms of its healthcare system, where it's under strain at the moment because of COVID.
Yes.
We need to have healthcare systems which are up to task, that are there for people to need and use when they are truly ill, as opposed to, I've got a bit of a cold and I'm going to the doctors. You know, if you can look after yourself with an over-the-counter medicine and self-remedies, that's what you should be doing.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, for someone who lives in Malaysia, for example, I'm appalled at how easy it is to have specialist access in Malaysia, because it's such a waste of resources.
For £1 a go.
Yeah, and it's wonderful. I mean, from an access wise, it's wonderful, but the reality is a gatekeeper concept of making sure, and like in many countries like the UK, you go to your primary care physician first, and then you get referred to a specialist. I mean, that's proper allocation of healthcare. Now, Chris, I delved into this because it's all back to how the economic impact to companies is going to be. The moment we have a handle on, the governments have a handle on COVID-19, we can reopen borders. And if we reopen borders, business can start to flow again. What are your thoughts?
We need to be reopening borders. I think the whole region needs to, the whole world needs to. It is holding back business. It's causing a lot of mental distress to people. I know people very well who haven't seen their families now for 18 months, and that's causing a lot of stress for them. Yeah. People have been separated from their closest family, their wives or children as well, because they just can't travel. The quarantine's too much, or they then can't get back to where they need to get back to.
Yeah.
And for a place like Singapore, for instance, it does start to erode your position as a regional hub as well, if you're not too careful. So we need to get to that position where we can reopen. But again, I'll come back to the collective point. ASEAN needs to do this collectively. You can't do it by yourself. One country could throw open its borders, but that's no good if you can't get your people out from your country to another country. So ASEAN as a 10 need to think about what can we do as a region to reopen up as a region, even if it's just amongst ourselves to start with, and maybe some key external markets. But they need to start thinking about this now. Now, I do know there are discussions that have happened between transport ministers and health ministers across the region and tourism ministers, but we're not seeing a lot of progress on that, unfortunately. In the meantime, the business community throughout the region is like, we want to get back to work. We want our people back in the offices in a safe way, of course, with safe distancing, but we want people back in the offices where they can be more productive, where we can brainstorm as teams, where we can get people functioning better. Because, you know, working from home, working remotely, people are getting tired, they're under mental duress, endless Zoom calls like we're doing today.
Yeah.
It gets harder and harder on the brain and on people's physicality. And businesses are suffering.
I think, Chris, you know, that romanticism that's associated with remote working has faded away. People have realized that you must have some physical contact in order for business really to be properly lubricated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we at the council, we were doing, before COVID, we were always out doing physical trips to countries. We've been meeting our stakeholders at ASEAN meetings or in bilateral meetings with governments. And they were so much better. That human touch, the side conversations, the meeting at the coffee point, you'd find out an awful lot more than you would at the meeting. Suddenly you're doing all these things online. They are so much more stage managed. You provide questions in advance. You're getting responses which are read from a script. There's no chance for interaction, and there's no chance to form new relationships. You know, as people have moved on from role to role, you can't form the new relationship unless you can actually sit down with someone and have that conversation with them. There's a limitation to what you can do over an internet connection.
Now, Chris, I want to ask you about, and you touched on this briefly in terms of foreign direct investment. And I want to ask you this in the concept of, in the context of RCEP, so Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, that's given trade, obviously, a huge boost potentially. But how have your members responded to the liberalization so far? Have they been able to take advantage of the opportunities, or has COVID kind of just put everything kind of on hold?
Your key word in that statement was potentially, I'm afraid. RCEP is signed. RCEP is not implemented yet. It needs more countries to ratify it before it can be implemented. And even then, there are very, very long lead times on large parts of it. And RCEP, you have to remember, is just yet another trade deal that the region's done.
Yeah.
Yes, it brings together some countries into a trade deal together for the first time. So China, Japan, Korea, for instance, come together for the first time inside a trade deal. But if you're sitting here in Singapore, or if you're sitting in Malaysia, assuming Malaysia ever gets around to ratifying CPTPP, you then got a multitude of choices. I'm exporting goods to, I don't know, Australia. Well, I can use the ASEAN Australia FTA, I could use my Singapore Australia FTA, I could use CPTPP, or I could use RCEP. So you now got a whole myriad of different agreements you can use, and you've got to work out which one is best for you at that particular moment in time for that particular good that you're exporting to the market you're exporting it to. But RCEP should be welcomed. It's a signal that ASEAN truly believes in multilateralism, is open for trade, and wants to do more on trade. What ASEAN needs to do is make sure it then delivers on what's inside RCEP, and indeed delivers what's inside the other trade deals they've got, including ones amongst themselves. Their track record is not fantastic in this, by the way.
Yes, I think I would tend, as a citizen of ASEAN, I tend to agree. I think sometimes rhetoric has overtaken reality. But Chris, I want to ask you about really a key point you mentioned, which is FDI. Now, obviously your members have put a lot of their potential investments in ASEAN on hold, or they've reduced the potential investment. What's the outlook like for your members in terms overall for 2022?
Let me start with the first part of that statement. I think a lot of companies put their investments on hold, not just European ones. So a lot of companies, particularly last year, were in preservation mode, preserve our cash to ensure our survival. So big investments for many, many companies, large and small companies, were being put on hold. And I think that's still the case this year. Looking forward to next year, well, obviously you hope that things get better. We hope we get a better handle on COVID. We hope that governments open up a lot more for their economies and open up borders. And I think that will then encourage investment to come back. And if you look at Southeast Asia, I think the fundamentals of the region are still there. It is a young and it is a vibrant region. It's a region which had fantastic growth rates pre-COVID-19. They were the envy of most of the developed world. Those growth rates will return. It had fantastic urbanization rates, and it had growth in its middle classes, between people with disposable income. If you're a manufacturer of almost anything, or if you're a provider of professional services or financial services, it's a great market to come to. Now, I don't see those fundamentals changing because of COVID-19. It may have knocked them back a little bit, but they will return. And they'll probably return pretty swiftly as well. Now, I think at the moment, because the situation we've all been in, there's a lot of pent-up demand in the region. There's pent-up demand for travel. There'll be pent-up demand for consumer goods. There'll be pent-up demand for a whole range of professional services as well. And as things start opening up, I think you'll see growth rates come back pretty quickly next year. And you'll see investment come back pretty quickly as well.
Now, before we end the conversation, Chris, any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
I guess my final thoughts would be, I think as a region, Southeast Asia needs to do a lot more collectively. At the moment, it's the sum of 10 parts, and they should be looking to become much more than the sum of the 10 parts that they are. And pushing ahead more on economic integration across the region, becoming truly that single production base they get on about and have been talking about since 2015, needs to be their absolute aim. And that will make them even more dynamic and even more attractive for FDI. And the region, I think, as a whole, notwithstanding COVID-19. COVID-19, I think, has made it even more an imperative. They need to advance economically, and they need to advance economically now in a very sustainable way. And by sustainable, I don't just mean green. A lot of Europeans say sustainability is green. It's not. It's, as I keep telling people in Brussels, in this part of the world, sustainability means putting food on the table and educating my kids and having access to a decent job.
Yep.
And then we'll worry about the environment. Actually, we should be worrying about the environment alongside and in parallel to those issues across the region. So I think pushing ahead more in a more meaningful and a clearer way on things like the ASEAN Economic Community, and doing it with a aura of sustainability around it, and thinking about the climate is an absolute must for the region. And unfortunately, I don't think ASEAN's had a really good COVID-19 as a collective.
Yeah.
There was talk last year about doing some stuff. They came up with the Hanoi Plan of Action, which on paper was great, but delivery has been a bit wanting. They came up with the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. Well, yes, they are heading down the same route, and much of what was in that, by the way, was stuff they were doing in any case, but they were trying to put a faster impetus behind it. They need to accelerate a lot of work and to make themselves have the best possible recovery from this current situation.
Now, Chris, it's been a pleasure having you on your show, and thank you very much for your insights.
No problem. Thank you, Brian.
Now, we've been speaking to Chris Humphrey, Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council, on Biztech's Trade Conversation show. This video will be on our Facebook and LinkedIn sites, as well as our website, www.biztech.asia. Please subscribe and like our various platforms. Thanks a lot for tuning in.